So Colossians and chapter 4. And we'll read from verse 2. And we'll read down as far as the end of the chapter, I think. Okay, so Colossians and chapter 4, reading from verse 2. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word, to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, and fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. They will make known to you all things which are happening here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, along with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus, these are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God, who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in praise, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you, and those who are in Laodicea, and those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas also greet you. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, along with Nymphas and the church that is in his house. Now, when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. And say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. This salutation by my own hand, Paul. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Amen. Now, we looked at Colossians in the week, I think, or a few weeks ago, and we saw that Colossians is one of the 4 epistles that Paul wrote whilst he was in prison. And this epistle is very much concerned with teaching, and with good teaching as opposed to unhelpful teaching. The church at Colossae had been visited by people who called themselves teachers. They were Jewish in background, we think, and they wanted the Gentile Christians to be circumcised. So Paul writes this epistle to them, and we saw, I think, when we looked at it, that there are strong links to the letter to Philemon. Philemon was a member of the church at Colossae, and Onesimus, the slave, who had stolen from Philemon and ran to Paul, had become a Christian. Paul now sends him back to Philemon with a willingness to pay the debt that Onesimus had accrued. Onesimus then settles in the church, and as we just saw in chapter 4, Onesimus the slave becomes a beloved brother. So this is the epistle then to the Colossian church. It's a general epistle, it's a circular, so we would have gone around different churches as we've just read. And what I want to do is look at 2 verses of chapter 4, and those are verses 5 and 6. So let's turn to them then. Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Now, do you remember why we are looking at these 2 verses? we've been talking on and off now on a Sunday night for some time about how good we are at putting extra pressures on ourselves. Preachers can do it, we can do it to ourselves, and we can do it to one another. It's as if it's not enough that we have all the other pressures of life. What we seem to want to do is make more pressure. Simply because we're Christians, we seek to put extra pressure on ourselves. Now, I've talked about that in 3 ways, do you remember? The first one was the pressure to be better than we are, a pressure in relation to sin. The second pressure was in relation to faith, and it's the pressure that we put on ourselves to be more believing than we are, to be more trusting than we are. And the third pressure is the pressure to be different, the pressure that we sometimes feel in relation to those who are not Christians. So they could be in our family, they could be our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors. We sometimes feel pressure to be different to them, to show how we are Christians by being different. And it's the pressure to witness, it's the pressure we feel to speak up, it's the pressure to evangelize. That pressure takes all different shapes and forms. Now, my aim is to take these 3 pressures off each of us. I hope that I would never preach in a way to put these pressures onto us. What my aim is to take these pressures off us as Christians, for us to understand that these pressures do not exist, to resist anyone who wishes to put these pressures on us, and even to resist ourselves when we feel ourselves putting these pressures on ourselves. So we should never feel the pressure to be better than we are. We should never feel the pressure to have faith. And this third pressure, the pressure to be different, to witness, to evangelize, to tell those who are not Christians, we should never feel that pressure either. The whole purpose of the Christian message is to take burdens off each one of us and not to put burdens on to us. So there are 3 texts then that we're going to look at. Tonight is the second of them that seem to talk about our relationship to the outsider, our relationship to the non-Christian. Last Sunday night, we looked at the first of the 3 texts, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And there Paul says the Christian is a living letter, written not with ink, but written by the Holy Spirit. And each Christian is a living letter, and the responsibility for that letter to be read lies with the non-Christian. We can't make ourselves read. We are clearly visible. The writing is clear to be seen. The Spirit of God has marked us with his grace. That is evident for all. But the responsibility lies with the non-Christian to do the reading. Now, let's look at these 2 verses in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. And here we go again. We're going to divide verses into 3 parts, okay? So if you take a look at these 2 verses, the first thing I want to talk about is the meaning of the word outsider. You see it in verse 4. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. Let's think about that then. What does that term mean? The second thing we'll then do is look at how Paul talks about walking. Okay, so the first of the verses, verse 5, has an emphasis on walking. Okay, and Paul says, walk in wisdom towards those who are outside, redeeming the time. So walk is to be wise and is to be redeeming. Let's think about what that means. And then last of all for tonight, we'll turn to verse 6, and we'll see that the emphasis in verse 6 is on speech. Verse 6, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer. That verse is very much concerned with talking. So verse 5 is concerned with walking, verse 6 with talking, but we'll start off with the word outsider. And Paul will use this word very often. You'll see the word outsider in 1 Thessalonians. You'll see it in 1 Corinthians. It's a word that is borrowed from Judaism. It's a Jewish term. It's a Greek word, but it's a Jewish term that used to be used in relation to the temple. So they were those who were allowed in to the temple, and then there were those who were kept outside. Do you remember there was a wall of separation between those who could go in and offer worship to Yahweh and those then who were excluded? Now, what Paul has done, he's taken that word and he's given it a Christian meaning. And he means deliberately to echo the Jewish idea that there is a very clear separation between those who are on the inside, those who are Christians, and those who are on the outside, those who are non-Christian. It's a very clear matter as far as the Apostle Paul is concerned. And in fact, this word outsider doesn't just refer to the temple. It was also used in relation to one of the feasts. And I think, let's just see how well we remember things. I think it was the Day of Atonement, when you would have an animal sacrifice that you would take into the temple, but then you'd have a living animal outside of the city. And what would happen, the priest, you remember, would lay his hands on that animal who was outside, and that animal would then be set free, and he would run out into the countryside. He was outside the camp. And the preacher to the Hebrews says that Jesus suffered outside of the camp. So outside is a place of abandonment. It's a place of separation. It's a place of exclusion. And if we're courageous enough this evening, it's also a place of curse. So when the animal had the priest's hands laid upon him and the sins of the nation were transferred to that animal, the animal became a curse. When Jesus was crucified outside of the city, he was in the place of curse. So to be outside is to be under the wrath and the curse of God. That's the idea here. So a non-Christian is being described here in these very vivid, very Jewish, very sacrificial ways of meaning someone who is beyond, someone who has been abandoned, someone who is excluded. That's the idea, okay? So what Paul says, when we are with such people, whether they are in our families, wherever we find them, how are we to be? How do we think? And so we need to come to these two verses. And the first, as we've said, verse 5, is concerned with walking. Now, walking is a metaphor for our way of being. How are we meant to be? And there are two ideas here, and they're really important ones. The first is wise, and the second is redeeming. Okay, so when we are in the company, whether we live our lives every day, whether it's our parents, children, grandchildren, those who are outside, those who are alienated from God, we are to be wise towards them, and we are to redeem. Now, those two ideas, before I even describe them, they describe how we ought to be about them. They are not descriptions of how we ought to be about ourselves. Now, this is where we always go wrong. Do you remember? Do you remember the most basic rule of reading your Bible? You don't make it all about us. We understand our Bibles primarily about God, and both wisdom and redeeming are ways of discussing God. So when God is wise and when God redeems, he's not thinking about himself, he's thinking about us. Now, in exactly the same way, when we are to be wise and when we are to redeem, we are not thinking about ourselves, we are thinking about others, following the way God is. Okay? God doesn't redeem himself. God isn't wise about himself. His wisdom and his redeeming is how he relates to us. Now, reflecting that then, how we are to be wise and how we are to redeem is relating to those who are outside. I hope that makes sense. Let's break each word down. The word wise means when we are with somebody who's an outsider, somebody who's not a Christian, we are to think about their condition. We are to be thinking about how they are, what it means for them to be an outsider. Walk in wisdom doesn't mean, now look, I got to check myself now, and I got to watch myself now, and I got to be careful about myself now. The sense of the Greek is the focus is on them. So we are to think about the outsider and his or her spiritual condition. This is to be our major concern. And you know, if we forget everything else, and it's fine if we forget things in our studies, please try to hold on to this. So when you're having that conversation, when you're loving somebody who's an outsider, when you're thinking about a parent or a child who's outside, you think about, you keep in mind uppermost their condition as an outsider. That's what it means to be wise. So there's lots of ways of illustrating this. Let me tell you the most simple, the most idiotic, the most completely irrelevant example, because I don't want to make any example too personal. But this week, in all this chaos of the pandemic, there's been one of those lists that the media love that's been produced about how much people earn. The sort of top earners in sport and the top earners in business and so on. Why they do it, I don't know. But the list of sports people that's been produced this week, top earners, has a certain tennis player as the person who's earned the most money this year, even though this person hasn't played any tennis because of the pandemic. He has earned this year £86 million, just this year. Now, when you think about that, you could have all sorts of responses, couldn't you? But to be wise means, as you think about this sports person, the phrase that should come to mind is, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? Now, that's a very poor example of what it means to be wise. So when you're getting excited about the kids, or we're getting excited about our relatives, or we are planning some big event with those we love, but they're outsiders, to be wise is to remember the spiritual nature of the condition that they're in. That's what it means to be wise. Now, the second phrase is redeeming the time. And redemption here has its root in the idea of Christ the Redeemer. It means to buy back. It means to make the most of. It means to take advantage of. And so the idea in verse 5 is this. Time has been given by God. Time has been given by God to the outsider. This person who is outside of salvation and grace and mercy has limited time. And our job, if you want to put that word there, I don't really, but what we need to think about, what we need to appreciate is the limited time that any human being has. And the person that we are in the company of, that person who's an outsider, see them, says Paul, as someone with limited time. And to be a redeemer is to seek to make the most of the time he or she has. Do you get that idea? Now, this isn't meant to be pressure. It's not meant to make us feel bad at all. That's the last thing that Paul is doing. He's helping us think about how we are with those who are not Christians. So verse 5 is very much about being wise, remembering, keeping it in the forefront of your mind, the spiritual condition, and the fact that time is not on our side. The redeeming of the time means thinking about or being aware of how time will march on. Can we grab time back? Can we grab opportunities back? That's the idea there, okay? That's what Paul talks about when he uses the word walk. So verse 5, let's read it again so that it's in our heads. It says, walk with wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. That's the idea. Now the next verse, verse 6, talks about speech. Okay, look at it again, verse 6. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Now this phrase in verse 6 needs some work. Let your speech be filled with grace, or all of grace, seasoned with salt. Now, the work is this. The word speech in verse 6 is the word logos. Now, every one of us, let's all admit it, we know the word logos, okay? We've heard of it. We know there was a ship called the Logos, we know it, okay? The word logos. And when you keep that word in mind, we go back to John's Gospel, don't we, in the first chapter. In the beginning was the word, logos. And that's a reference to the Son of God, who was with God in the beginning. So this word logos doesn't necessarily mean to talk. It can mean to reason. It can mean your mind. It can mean rationality. Okay, now I don't want to get too kind of heavy here, but in these verses, the surrounding verses, Paul has used the ordinary word for speech. Let me see if I can find it. Verse 4, I think. No, I'm lying. Let's go to verse 3. Meanwhile, praying always for us that God would open a door for the word to speak. Okay, now that's the ordinary word for speak. He doesn't use that in verse 6. He uses logos. Okay? And so what Paul is telling us here is this. Let me see if I can make it, not so complicated. Paul is saying in verse 6 this. What he wants each Christian to have is a logos, an understanding of the grace of God that we've experienced. The word, the logos, the speech, be filled with grace. So have a mind, have an understanding as best we can now, because, we're not saved by our understanding, are we? But have an understanding as best you can of the grace that you've experienced. Try and have your thoughts, or try and have some sense of the fact that you've been saved by grace. Try and have that. It's there in your heads. It's the logos, the reason in your heads. Seasoned with salt. Now that's a wonderful phrase. It means having the right ingredients. So he's telling us that as best we can, by the help of the Spirit, have all the ingredients in your head. The ingredients of grace in your head. Your understanding of what God's done for you. Have that in your heads, he says. So that, and this is the key phrase in verse 6, so that you are ready to answer those. Did you notice it in verse 6? Look at it again. That you may know how you ought to answer each one. And there it is. Okay? That's where we've been trying to get to. Our relationship to the person who's not a Christian in verse 6 now, and I'll summarize the whole thing in a second. In verse 6 is you are to be ready to answer. You are not to try and create opportunities. You are not to try and force a conversation. Your job as a Christian is not to raise the subject first and try and get a word in. Now, I don't know how many times I've heard that phrase. Oh, I managed to get a word in there and I managed to get a word in somewhere else. That's not what Paul is saying at all. Our job is not to get a word in with a non-Christian, to try and, get a hit in. We got a friend who used to, when she was growing up, her family would take her out to do witnessing, and she would have to get in what was called in the family gospel hits. Let's get a hit for the gospel here and a hit for it there. We are not to take the initiative. That's the great thing here. Okay, it's not down to us. What is expected of us, if we can even use the word expected, is to be ready to have an answer to anyone who asks us anything. And when we read at the end of verse 6 how you ought to answer each one, doesn't mean each one of us. Each one of us needs to be ready to have an answer. It means being ready to answer each one of those who may ask you, who may start a conversation with you, who may raise it with you because they're concerned or they're interested or God may be at work in them. Okay? That's the idea here. So that you've got a good bit of an idea in your head of what God's done for you. You've got some understanding of how it's all of grace. It's not because you're any better than anyone else. It's due to the grace of God. You've got a sense of that. You've got a sense that it's Christ who saves us. And you've understood how he went to the cross for us. He was raised. So you've got that in your head. You've been taught that by God. So there it is. And out of that knowledge that you have, you are then ready should anyone ask you anything. That's the thrust of what Paul is saying. So there's really two elements here, isn't it? There's one that is very personal. There's one that you might not have to share at all. Verse 5 ultimately may mean you don't do anything. You're just keeping in your head the fact that the person outside, whatever they've got, whatever success they've achieved, however big their house, however large their car, however great their bank account, however many degrees they may have, however irritating they may be to you as a colleague, the person who is outside, you keep in your mind the wisdom that tells you that the most important thing is their spiritual condition. Now, this is personal. Verse 5 is about you and how you think, okay? And then, as you think about the person who's outside, you know that there's limited time. You know that time is going by for them. The weeks and the months and the years are passing. You know this. And so you want, if you can, to buy back an opportunity. You want to make the most of any opportunity that might come along. That's redeeming the time. So it's not that you are ignoring the opportunities or that you don't notice them. You're ready. You're hoping for an opportunity. You're looking out for it, if you like. But you don't force the issue. You are not meant to get in there first, to try and get something across or to make some point. That's not at all what Paul is saying. So think of verse 5 as about you and your outlook and your thoughts and how you've understood the situation. And then verse 6 is the idea that you've got a sense of it in your head. You can kind of, you've got from your own experience a knowledge of what it means to be saved and how a person is saved. You've understood that. You don't need to be a scholar at all, but you've got that understanding. Now, with all of that work done, it's a matter of waiting for your opportunities. It's a matter of waiting for someone to ask, to raise, to want you to say something, to ask a question. You wait for those. And when those come, that's the work that you do. You respond to that work. And in that moment, when somebody asks you a question and they want to know about Christ, or they want to know about your Christian life, in that moment, you've every reason to believe that God will give you the words to say, that God will own what you say, that he'll authenticate and use what you say, because it is God who is behind that question. It is God who is at work in the lives of those who've raised a question with you. And so you see, in wisdom, you see that this is an opportunity created by God in his grace and his mercy towards those who are outside. So the word would be ready. Now, the third text, we won't look at it tonight, we'll look at it next Sunday. The third text also has that sense of readiness and being ready. So it's a defensive response. It's a passive response. That's the idea. Does that make sense? That the responsibility lies with the outsider to ask, to talk, to want to know. But when that comes, as a good redeemer of the time, we are ready then to give our answer. So the whole thrust of this is to take the pressures off that we feel sometimes. Perhaps you don't. I know that many of us do. And I know that for a very long time, there's been a heavy burden placed upon congregations and upon individual Christians to be what we call witnesses, to be evangelists, to go out there and to do this work. And you may remember from last Sunday that the actual evangelistic ministry, Paul will discuss it in terms of himself as an apostle, or in terms of perhaps others who have the office and the role of bringing the message to those who've not heard it before. So he sees that as part of the church life, but it's an office. It's part of the ministry, if you like. The idea that everybody should be doing it, every single member should be this kind of, mini evangelist, is sometimes taken from the book of Acts. But it's been around now in church life for 100 years, 150 years or so. And it got to such a point, I don't know if you'd agree with me, it got to such a point that it almost became unquestioned. It was like an orthodox statement. It was an absolute truth that we all had to be involved, aggressively getting out there and doing these things. And what's interesting is that as that happened, not only has the church got weaker and smaller and less effective, but this whole emphasis began when the church started to lose its position in society and its influence in society. And it's almost like the two go hand in hand. As the church started to shrink, and let's be careful now how we describe it, but as the church began to lose ground, so there was this emphasis that every Christian must be out there doing this kind of work. We go to our Bibles, we go to our texts, and we see that overwhelmingly the New Testament epistles have very little to say about the outsider, very little to say about how we relate to the outsider. There's absolutely no emphasis at all in the New Testament epistles for the churches to go out and hold campaigns and hold meetings and hold events and hold gatherings and all that sort of thing. There's absolutely nothing to be found in the New Testament epistles to tell us that. And if you find it, then well done, because nobody else has. What we do have is the emphasis on the roles and the evangelist, the apostle, and these 3 verses that have some connection to the outsider. So just to finish, the first, 2 Corinthians 3, you are clearly a living letter, clearly written upon by the Spirit of God, clearly seen by others. The responsibility is there. This one wants you to do a bit more thinking. First of all, a bit more thinking about the outsider. Keep in mind the spiritual condition of the outsider. Keep that in mind. Then, says Paul, have some understanding yourself of what God has done for you. If then somebody asks you a question, if somebody raises the matter, redeem the time. Be ready. Take that opportunity as God enables you so that you can then speak. You can then articulate, put into words what God has done for you. And I don't know if we will, but I want to end with, as in, I don't know if we will get to this verse again, but I want to end by going back to a verse we looked at the beginning of this series, Galatians 2:20. Will you do that? Let's finish in Galatians 2:20. And for me, Galatians 2:20 is the most wonderful verse to get rid of all these 3 pressures. The pressure to be better, the pressure to have faith, and the pressure that we feel to be a witness. Now, Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, that last phrase is the only phrase you need when you're thinking about the outsider. He loved me and gave himself for me. That's all you need to understand. So if anybody raises a question, if anybody asks you anything, all we say is he loved me and gave himself for me. If anybody says to you, you're not much of a Christian, look at what you like, look at how you live, look at all your faults. If anybody says that to you, you're ready with your reason. You're ready there to speak. And you say, look, I may be full of faults and I may be a very poor Christian, but this is my message. He loved me and gave himself for me. So you may not think much of me, and your non-Christian parents may not think much of you, and your non-Christian kids may not think much of you, and so on. None of it matters. It doesn't matter if no one thinks much of us. Our witness to the world isn't look at me and how different I am, and look at me and how much better I am. Our witness to the world is me living in the flesh, me living this now life with all its weakness, me as I am. He loved me and he gave himself for me. That's all we need to understand, and that's all we need to say. And in saying that, we are bearing witness to those who are outside. So we take the pressure off.